welcome to Conversations with IFS. It's brought to you in collaboration with GH1 TV and the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Today we have a very interesting guest, so don't go anywhere, hold on tight and we'll be right back. Welcome back. Today we have a very interesting guest in our lineup. He is the Oxfam West Africa Advisor on Inequality. He holds an MA in International Relations and Development Studies from the University of East Anglia in the United Kingdom. He's also a graduate of the Ghana Institute of Journalism and the Poynter Media Institute in Florida. He's a Chevening Scholar, an Alfred Friendly Press Fellow, and he has lots of accolades under his belt. He is none other than Mr. Kwesi Obeng. Mr. Obeng, you're most welcome.
Thank you.
So, you're the Oxfam West Africa Advisor on Inequality. What exactly does that entail and what does that mean?
Well, this is it. West Africa, it's a particularly unique region. Not least because it's endowed with enormous natural resources, and yet it's also one of the poorest regions in the world. You have a substantial number of the countries classified as very poor, and they rank very low in the Human Development Index of the UNDP, and so the region is a particularly unique one. And don't also forget that because of the history of the region, it's such that you have this enormous amount of resources that could transform people's lives, and yet the people are poor. So the paradox, and also reinforced by the insecurities in the region, along with the effects of climate change. The Sahara is just sitting right above the frontiers of Ghana, and so it heightens the issues of inequality and also poverty and underdevelopment in our region. And so that makes our region particularly unique, and also having the language barrier. It's not necessarily an issue, but then it also means that it's a bit more difficult for countries in the region to communicate easily. But that's a subject for another day. But the uniqueness of the region makes it a particularly interesting subject to discuss around issues of poverty, issues of inequality, issues of underdevelopment and progress generally.
So what are some of the main inequalities that we have in the region?
I think I'll come to the drivers of inequality in the region, but let's face it, the great equalizer is said to be education. Unfortunately, our region has some of the lowest educated people in the world. Yes, just the other day, leaders had this meeting in Dakar around education, and also around girl-child marriage. It became apparent that our region has some of the lowest educated people. So if you take the case of Nigeria, I'll come to the statistics, but the point to be made at this stage of the conversation is that we do have issues of education in terms of the barriers and the inaccessibility of education in our region, which therefore means that people are unable to move up the ladder in terms of being able to move up to improve the quality of their lives. If you look at the data even on Ghana, is the fact that mothers, for example, that have education, even up to the secondary level, it has a significant impact on the mortality of their children. And so the point is that education is an important element in addressing inequality. And yet, education is not being addressed in a sustainable way. So over the past few years, I mean, let's say the past decade, actually from the 1990s, we've seen a significant improvement in the numbers that have access to education.
Mm-hmm.
But the question to ask yourself is, what is the quality? Because really the quality is the most important. If you're having to have your child go to lie on the stomach to study under a tree, which therefore means that if the sun is too hot, or if it's raining, that child is not going to come to school, or that child would have to cross a river on a boat, it limits the child's ability to access education. And then also we have the case where, just a classic Hirschman topography, where essentially the public sector educational system, including health, somehow over time seem to have become, death traps, more or less. So if you take the case in Ghana, for example, and it cuts across the region, where educational facilities in the public sector, particularly at the primary level, are so deprived, basically deprived of everything: teachers, resources, infrastructure. But as you move up the chain, somehow in our country, the secondary schools in the public hands are the best. I mean, the question for us to ask ourselves is, why have we left the basic education sector, which really is the heart of it? Because getting as many people to get access, kids to get access to basic education, quality education, it really improves the ability to move up the chain along the secondary school to university and whatever they want to be in life. But basically, if you truncate the ability of a child to access education at the primary level, and that child can't progress to secondary, and therefore up the chain, unfortunately, we seem to have over the years defunded primary education. Even though we've seen a massive enrollment, and I think credit to the governments of the past have improved based on also improved access to education based on some of the growths we've had over the past 2 decades in particular. But as it is, I can tell you that it's not sustainable, and also it's easily reversible. Just the other day, I think IFS just talked about the debt burden, where up to 41 or so percent of every CD goes into paying for debt. Now, what it means is that basic infrastructure, basic services like education, health, social protection will be the ones that will be cut off if there is a crisis in the economy today. And so I think that we haven't prioritized the areas, not just simply on paper, but in the funding and in the supervision of the sectors that are key to addressing issues of inequality broadly in our countries, the countries of our region. Yeah.
So you talk about education, and you say one of the key things is access, especially to private. But I want you to elaborate on how can we resolve this? Because really, if we've got issues of quality and access at the primary level, then we really have a problem, because if children cannot get into education at that basic level, then they've got no hope of progressing to secondary and even tertiary. So how can we, what research have you been able to do, or have you read that addresses
Well,
this?
I mean, it's interesting because Oxfam has done Oxfam in Ghana is doing an enormous amount of work around education, particularly in the 3 poorest regions in the country, northern region in particular, Upper West and Upper East. But I also want to scale it up to across the region. So we've seen, as I said earlier, we've seen an increment in terms of access. Quite a good number of kids now have access to education. But the real challenge is the quality and monitoring of that. Therefore, I think it's important. So 1 is the access bit, but 2 is also the quality. And I think we're happy with the access. We're not paying as much attention to the quality. And that is an important issue that we need to address. And I think there are a number of solutions to this. 1 is the policies. We do have the policies. They have to be implemented.
Can you give examples?
Well, I mean, so for example, look at every budget. There's talk about teachers' access to education, improvement of teachers, one, in terms of the education, and two, in terms of their postings to the various regions, and even, in terms of the access to their salaries, and all kinds of incentives to get teachers to move, particularly to the rural areas. Yeah. Now, often those are never followed through. They never follow through. And I think, too, is that when you have a large access, I mean, can you imagine one teacher having to deal with 100 kids? Yeah. I mean, what quality can you get? Mm-hmm. And yet, the same people who are in charge of the policy, implementing the policy, formulating the policy, are the ones who send their kids to the private schools. And the private schools, they insist for no more than 10, no more than 12, no more than 15 in a class. Attention to kids at that level is critical. Mm-hmm. Now, the supervision in the public sector in terms of education is close to nil. Part of it has to do with the defunding that came with the structural adjustment of the 80s and the 90s. And I think we need to return to, one, providing not just simply access, but also ensuring that the quality is good and comparable to the best in the world. And also incentivizing the teachers that spend a significant amount of time with the kids. They shape the kids in a way. I mean, if they spend 8 hours, some parents don't spend that much with their kids. Mm-hmm. That probably, it's about a week. Now, it's important to make sure that the teachers are comfortable enough to handle the kids. And also a decent number they can actually help educate. And as it is, I think we're just simply taking them through, and I'm afraid we would produce educated illiterates. Gone through the educational system, but really can't contribute meaningfully to the best of their ability to the country's development. And let me insist, let me point out that this cuts across the region. Interestingly, I think Ghana is even doing quite better in terms of, you'll be surprised, in terms of investment into the sector. As an example, Ghana invests about twice in its annual budget to education compared to Nigeria. Do we get the same returns? Obviously we're not. So what I'm trying to say is that there are gaps that we need to identify and address. Yeah. Those are important. We can come to some of the gaps. One is the issue of supervision I talked about earlier.
But I mean, because of my own personal background in education, this is something that's quite dear to my heart. And in a previous life, in my former workplace, I was part of a project that looked at these issues and in the upper East region. Okay. And what you're talking about supervision is right. And also incentivizing teachers. I mean, sometimes teaching can be quite a thankless task and a very difficult and uphill one. So if you're posted to quite extreme terrains or areas and you're not given that incentive to go and offer your best, then it's really difficult. But I want us to move on to another area where you see quite a lot of inequality, which is the health sector and access to health services as well. I mean, what do you advise on that? What have been some of your observations?
So, health, education, and social protection are very important aspects of Oxfam's work in this country, but then also in the region. In part because, as I talked about, education, health, education really impacts on every aspect of our lives. And at any given time, you would visit a health facility. And interestingly, this country seemed to have taken the right steps in terms of, say, initiating this whole universal access to health. But if you look at the implementation over time, now it's become burdensome. It's not giving us the results. Mm-hmm. So we're pretending we're offering access to health to the people, but as we speak, only I think 40% of the population are enrolled in the NHIS or National Health Insurance. Far more than that, and insidious, is the fact that because of the administration, the running of the whole system. Now, health facilities are charging, patients all kinds of fees, including on drugs that ordinarily as part of the national health insurance. So what you're saying, the point I'm making is that even though we have this policy, universal health care, it is really not working. The system is really broken and it ought to be fixed. Unfortunately, the approach to resolving the issues a bit more like fixing, a broken throttle and getting 1 gallon here to get it to move to the next stop. It's not.
So back to the drivers of inequality. Can we go into some details on the drivers?
Well, I think two things. One, the drivers of inequality in Ghana are cuts across the region. So they're very similar, same drivers of inequality. Just that in some countries you may see a certain, just some minor emphasis, but pretty much across the region. I think one of the key drivers of inequality in our region, it's really the elite capture. Yes, elite capture is a huge drain and a driver of inequality in our country, and lack of participation of citizens, of the lack of involvement of citizens in the governance process. So one is that because the elite capture is so deep, it cuts off a lot of people in the governance structure. Take the case. Why is it that consistently we have very few women putting themselves up for political office? Part of it is down to the capture of the state by the elite, both business and political. So an example, so as I said,
the issue of the gender thing.
Well, it's gender, but the thing is that the patriarchy is linked to the capture of the state. So if you look at the structure of the elite in our country, the setup is such that the traditional centers of power includes the business, but then also the elite, the political class, and of course it cuts back to the traditional systems we have. So access to land is an important part. So to address, for example, gender inequality, you have to address issues of land. And who holds the land on behalf of the people?
The chiefs.
The chiefs. It's part of the patriarchy. It's part of that structure of governance in our system. So that's just one. And then I think also an important part, and it cuts again, this cuts across the region, is also the issue of the fiscal regimes we have. Now, it's unfair across the region, the kinds of fiscal regimes. So I'll give you an example. Remember, in this country, according to the 2010 census, up to 87% of Ghanaians are in the informal sector.
Yes.
Now, those who make up significant, income in the informal sector pay just about 8% on their income, but the lowest bracket pay close to half of their income on as taxes. Now, quite frankly, how fair is that? That is not fair. So the fiscal regime, but I'll scale up from the local level to some of the national policies. We know that tax incentives, tax holidays, tax avoidance are a huge drain on our economy. Countless studies reveal that. And yet, consistently, we continue to award all kinds of incentives to huge multinational companies, quite frankly, that are far richer than this country. And interestingly, most of these companies don't really need them. Go to all the available data, including IMF World Bank studies. What companies look out for? It's not the tax incentives, but of course, if you give them, they'll take. They look out for the peace, the stability of the country. Ghana has it right, or is renowned for that. They're looking at the infrastructure. They're looking at the human capacity. So that's where the education thing comes in. And yet, our first point of call in terms of attracting investment is to basically create loopholes for companies to shift profits out of our country through all kinds of aggressive, practices that we can come to when we get down to address how we address some of these. So that's also another one. I mean, the other driver of inequality, as I talked about, is just a patriarchal system we have, and how it actually undermines our ability to address the systemic structural inequalities inherent in just our whole setup. Okay. And then there are other forms of, other drivers of inequality. Some are a bit global, but invariably the decisions have to be taken at the local level. And I think that if we can address some of these drivers, we will be able to address, one, the huge gap in terms of resources to address inequality, poverty reduction, if you like. And then also, I think one driver is just also the fact that the growth we've had, and remember, this year, Ghana is supposed to grow over 8%. Historically, the growth in this country have never been shared. It's been exclusively the preserve of the 10-20% of our country. So I give you an example when we come down to the details. But the data reveals that growth in this country have never been shared, and that it actually widens the inequality gap. Now, that's not to say that over the past 2 decades we haven't succeeded in addressing inequality across the region, from Burkina to Senegal. These countries have, including Ghana and Nigeria, have managed to address issues of poverty, so in terms of extreme poverty. But at the same time, we've seen the gap, inequality, increase between the bottom 20% and the top 20%. Okay. And it's insane if you look at the data.
Okay. On that note, we'll go for a very quick break. Don't leave us. We'll be right back. Hello and welcome back to Conversations with IFS. Today my guest is Mr. Kwesi Obeng, who is the Oxfam West Africa Advisor on Inequality. Welcome back. So let's come back to Ghana and look at equalities here. And I just wanted to ask you, is our society structured in a way that promotes inequality?
Well, thank you. I think a number of things. One is that there are different forms of inequality. And two is that these forms manifest themselves at different times starkly. But yeah, I think our system is structured in such a way that it promotes inequality, all the various forms of inequality.
Can you give examples?
Well, I mean, so an example is gender inequality. I mean, and also we have income inequality, urban, rural, spatial inequality, north, south. All of them, you find them in this country. I mean, if I take gender for example, I was saying a while ago that the 2010 census indicates that, or at least revealed that, close to 87% of our population function economically in the informal sector. That means a vulnerable, a huge percentage of the population operate in a vulnerable area. Job security, unavailable, unpredictability, basically lack of insurance. There's no fallback. And guess what? Who are the people who operate? The bulk of the people who operate in the informal sector tend to be women. And And same, it goes even to agricultural sector. The agricultural sector is the backbone. I mean, it employs the largest number of people in this country, of which women constitute the bulk, over 60%. Now, their lack of access to land and land title, is a great disincentive to basically allow these women to be able to raise their game and move up the chain. And so consistently, you have women having just tiny plots of land to deal with, and the titles do not even belong to them. And it's unthinkable that 21st century, we still have not addressed the systemic issues around the patriarchy in our system that deprives women equal access to land, an important resource as land in our country. So if you look at it, land is really the most important factor. And for as long as we haven't been able to address it, I think that structurally our system is structured to deprive women equal access to an economic factor such as land. And I'll tell you, the inequality between North-South is huge. The three northern regions, the northern region, the Upper East, Upper West, remain the poorest regions in the world, in the country. Northern region really lags behind in pretty much all the indicators. And
why do you think this is?
Well, I mean, I think a number of factors. Part of it is also the patriarchy. Part of it is also that politically, we have not invested the time, the type of resources we need to invest in bridging the gap. So if you look at the mismanagement that have gone on around attempts to kind of bridge the gap, you constantly find a group of people that basically truncate that objective. But if we do not address the gap between the North and the South, there's no way this country can move forward.
Yes.
Because it's one country, and once a small, even if you take a small piece, it's lagging behind. Essentially, it's going to drag the rest of the country. And once you are able to move, if you are able to, for instance, create jobs now and create economic opportunities in the three northern regions that allows people to function and make decent incomes. Now, don't forget that part of the country is also pretty fertile. A significant part, quantity of our food comes from that part of the region. So if you even invested in agriculture, for example, to improve the quality of agriculture in the region, you can transform the quality of life. And not just simply agriculture, but actually also in terms of education, healthcare, the three regions lag behind. And recently, we've seen that actually regions such as Central, Ashanti, Volta have slowed in terms of poverty reduction. So, but the point is that, one, we haven't followed through with some of the policies we put out. And I think that that really is the bane of this country. And part of it has to do, again, back to the political capture of the instruments of governance and the economic power. And so the resources that should go to finance these areas and these projects and these economic activities and address some of these systemic structural inequalities never get to their destination. And so year on, you find that inequality, either we're making, taking 2 steps forward or 1 step forward and 2 steps back. And the thing is that it introduces the element of fragility. Nothing is secured. The ground is just shifting beneath, many of our people. And I quite frankly think that we have to address this. And then also I need to tell you, I need to state, for example, that if you look at this country, the poverty levels amongst the kids, among kids, it's about 40% more to that of adults. In other words, kids are likely to be poor or poorer than adults. There are different factors that account for that. So issues of economic opportunities for the parents to be able to put them through education, there are parts of this country that kids do not even have a meal.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, if kid does not have a meal, I mean, what kind of kid are we raising as a country?
Yeah.
And not only that, but then also if you look at the growth we've had right from the 90s, particularly around the 2000s when we had this boom in economic commodities. Yeah. Well, what it is that the top 20% basically creamed off close to 50%. Actually, it's 48.2 thereabout percent of that. And guess what? For the bottom 20%, it's less than 2%.
So we need more, so what you're saying is we need more inclusive growth.
Inclusive growth is really the heartland. If we do not address that growth, we can talk about all kinds of growth. It won't make impact, and we'll continue to have poor and people who are deprived of the opportunities to make contribution to this country, deprived of the opportunities. And so I think economic opportunities, we need to spread the growth. It needs to be inclusive. And so it gets back to the issue of whether is it poverty, kind of the whole conversation around economic growth, inequality, and poverty reduction. I mean, I'll go for the argument around distribution, because quite frankly, we've seen that the LEAP has helped address some of the extreme poverty we have in the country.
For the LEAP program you're referring to.
Yes, but again, it's not a perfect instrument to address inequality. But we've seen that systematically it's helped to address some of the very stark, extreme inequalities we have in this country. And the question is, how do we scale that up to rope in as many of the extremely poor, and also those that are unequally, do not have equal or access to some of the basic infrastructure and facilities that would allow them to move up, not just along the economic chain, but then also the political, the social chain.
But don't you think part of the problem is that as a society, we have almost become immune to these inequalities? We see them on a regular basis. For example, we see people begging for alms in road traffic, we see countless homeless people, and it's almost like we've become immune to it. But how can we become more sensitive towards these huge economic and social inequalities that we see on a daily basis, and therefore make sure and put pressure on our duty bearers to actually do something about it?
Well, I mean, I think that's a very interesting perspective, but that's frankly the truth. Remember, I referred to the classic Hedgeman topography we have in our country, where basically those who formed particularly the upper and the so-called middle class basically don't look at the public educational system. I mean, tell me how many public schools, don't talk to me about the Legon primary. No, primary. How many public primary schools you know of in Accra? Just mention. I mean, it's hard for the middle class and the upper class to even know the location of these. And even where they are located, you'll be surprised. Located around lorry parks, markets, with no walls, no gates. And yet, the private schools have gates, have security, have fence,
CCTV cameras, some of them.
Exactly. So, and the kids can see that it's not that I'm not getting what my friend is getting or this other kid is getting. So, but what I'm trying to say is that yes, it's systemic, and I think that somehow we're not challenging duty bearers enough. And I think that part of it is that I think the middle class in this country, whatever you classify them to be, are complicit.
Oh,
complicit.
How?
Well, I mean, the thing is this, that in many societies that have brought about change, it's actually led by those who have the education, who have the means to make a living, who mobilize and bring along those who are economically, socially disempowered to put pressure on the elite.
Okay.
But in our case, and it's not just simply here, we seem really disengaged from all the issues that people care about the most. So we see people who are the ones who buy the stuff in the traffic.
The middle classes mostly.
There you go. It's not the so-called, it's not the bottom end of the strata of society. So I think that we need to be a bit more sensitive. And I think for me, it worries me personally because I kind of, growing up, you felt that you were made to understand that your neighbor is your sister, it's your brother, which means that you're responsible somehow for them. But as we become duty bearers, it doesn't quite filter through, and as our lives become a bit more comfortable, we seem to forget those values. And I think we need to return to some of those fundamental values in our society. We seem to have taken on board this whole economic fundamentalist approach to everything, and we do not see the need to pay attention to some of these core values that for years have kind of built our society, giving us kind of identity as a people.
Don't you think that's because maybe as we move up the economic or social ladder, we insulate ourselves from uncomfortable realities? So let's say, okay, as you move up the social ladder, the roads are quite bad everywhere. And you, instead of fighting for the roads to be better, maybe you'll buy a more resistant or bigger car. So you don't quite feel the shakes and the bumps so much. You move to nicer neighborhoods with bigger walls, etc. So you insulate yourself from certain types of insecurity. So I think maybe the issue is that, as you said, you know, as the middle classes, we're not acting as maybe advocates for the people who are less fortunate than ourselves. But anyway.
Yeah. But it has implications on the welfare of every citizen in this country. Security, you can get into your high-walled palace. If your neighbor is hungry, you are not safe. But to move away from that, I think fundamentally we need to return to some of the core values of our society, caring for one another, which therefore also means that the capture of the state by just a tiny few ought to be broken. But to break that, it would take mobilization, mass mobilization of our people. And I remember in 2015 at the FFD, that's the Financing for Development meeting in Addis Ababa, where, you know, the funding strategy for the SDGs were agreed on before the SDGs were adopted by leaders in September in New York. The former South African president said something. He said, when he was launching a campaign around how to stop the hemorrhage of resources from Africa, to keep them to develop our country. Now, he said that he made a point that African governments only listen to pressure from the people. So, and that, for me, I think it's instructive. To bring about change, we need to build that mass momentum across board and put pressure on duty bearers, to put pressure on policymakers and implementers to do what we want. In other words, to improve the quality of life of our people. It's not good enough to have the policies, and in fact, in many of these policies, they're still self-serving. They do not address the fundamental needs and issues to address inequality in our country.
Okay, thank you very much. Now time for a quick break. We'll be back with you shortly. today's guest is Mr. Kwesi Obeng, who is the West Africa Advisor on Inequality for Oxfam. So, Mr. Obeng, we've had some interesting discussions on inequality and the various types of inequality that are prevalent in our society. And I would like us to move to fiscal policy and its impact on inequality, whether we have used fiscal policy to narrow the gap between the top, let's say 10% and the bottom 10%.
Well, thank you. I think fiscal policy is an important tool in its own right, but even far more importantly is the implications it could have on addressing the broader systemic structural inequalities. It's important. I mean, let me preface my my response by saying that it's impossible to move beyond aid if we do not address the gaps in our fiscal policy. We can forget about it. Two things. One is that globally, aid is dwindling anyway. So whether you're moving beyond aid, it's dwindling right across board. For the last 10 years, since the economic crisis, the austerity measures in the major donor countries has meant that it's dwindling. And even then, it's beginning to move, the aid is beginning to move to private sector anyway, not to the state. And so it's inevitable that countries would have to move beyond aid. I'll come to addressing the specificities you've raised in your question, but I wanted to just frame this a bit at the regional and link it to some of the global processes and come back home to this country. So again, at the heart of what is known, well, in September 2015, world leaders adopted the Sustainable Development Goals. Central to that is the issue of domestic resource mobilization. That to be able to achieve the SDGs, countries would have to raise their game around domestic resources. In other words, they have to raise the resources from home. Interestingly, for a region like West Africa, we do have quite some space to be able to mobilize resources. I mean, countless studies have been done by different actors, including the World Bank, IMF, even governments, CSOs. And I remember one we launched way back in, two of our partners launched back in 2016, where they found out that West Africa will lose close to $9.6 billion annually from corporate tax incentives. Right. Ghana, it's about $2.2 billion from just corporate tax incentives. Now, but and here we're talking about lowering, corporate income tax. But I'll come back to that. So the point I'm trying to make is that in our country, and again, it cuts across the region, the fiscal regimes are structured in such a way, and also the implementation complicates the issue. So I'll come to two issues. One is that if you look at the fiscal regime, many studies point out that if you take the case of Ghana, the extractive sector is the biggest contributor currently. It's the reason why this country is going to grow at a rate of about 8.4. It's because of the extractive sector, the oil, and of course the other minerals. Well, the thing is this: the structure of the fiscal regime for the sector is such that, and because they are also hidden in contracts, we basically give away not just simply jobs, but actually significant income that we could have harnessed to develop this country. Earlier, I was talking about the fact that many studies, including IMF studies, point out that companies are not keen, they are more interested. There are more fundamental things they look out for other than tax incentives. And yet, we continue to award them unnecessary incentives. In fact, I was struck going through your records, IFS, I noticed that, there was this study where you were basically saying that the government should go ahead and give all kinds of incentives to the to companies operating in the oil sector. And I was struck by that because, quite frankly, what studies have we done to actually quantify the losses we're going to incur in terms of loss of revenue and their implications? If you look at the mining sector, there's no evidence, and yet we continue to give all kinds of incentives. Remember, just a few years ago, the government reviewed the agreement with the fiscal agreement with Goldfields, and the country is going. And Goldfields put it up on their website in terms of the savings they were going to make. That is a loss to the country. You know that in this country, mining companies and many mining multinational companies don't even pay local government tax. And yet the average person who has a kiosk pays. Quite frankly, how fair is that? And so the gaps, not only are they limited at that level, but if you take the kinds of bilateral investment treaties, double tax treaties, last year, exactly a year ago, this government signed the bilateral, the double tax treaty with Mauritius. Now, that document has not been made available. But I do know that there were issues with that agreement, how that was resolved. And we know that countries like South Africa, Kenya, Uganda, in the case of Uganda and Rwanda and South Africa, they've had to renegotiate. Part of the reason why just a year ago, Uganda, for example, won a massive case against one of the major oil companies was because the company wanted to use the double tax agreement they had signed with Mauritius to basically shift resources. But because they had a safeguards, the government basically had prepared and was able to take on the company, and the government won over $400 million. So in our case, there's not been any reviews. There's not been any review of published review of any of these bilateral investment treaties. And the point to be made is that these bilateral investment treaties, companies are always, treaty shopping, looking for where they can shift their resources away from where they make their wealth. So if company A is investing in this country, they pretend that they have their head office in an offshore country where they pay no tax. This country, I think, capital gains tax is about 10%. In Mauritius, it's zero rated. So basically, if you sign an agreement with Mauritius, what it means is that double tax treaty overrides even your own domestic. So those companies are not going to pay. And that is resources that you need to mobilize to address the structural inequalities we have in the system. So you cannot move beyond aid if you do not address those gaps. And as we speak, again, I'm on the Ghana-Mauritius treaty. Colleagues, friends in Kenya, for example, have taken the Kenyan government to court for signing a double tax agreement because from their analysis, they revealed that the country was going to lose significant amount of domestic resource revenue, literally, to Mauritius. And actually, it's not really to Mauritius, but to the companies that pretend that they have their head office. And we know that often they're just letter boxes. They are not really operating from those places. And so I think that we need to address those gaps in our fiscal regime. As we speak, remember earlier I was talking about the fact that because you have a significant part or percentage of our population in the informal sector, in vulnerable jobs, they pay, incidentally, those at the lower end of the informal sector pay far more taxes than those at the top end of the informal sector. I mean, the farmer, I'm not saying that every person in the informal sector should pay taxes, but we know that there are sectors within the informal sector that make huge sums of money and that pretend to be informal. because there are opportunities. It's important for us to seal those gaps. So even as you are sealing the gaps at the global level, more or less, in terms of dealing with the hemorrhage of resources by the major multinationals that invest in our countries, by not giving them those unnecessary tax incentives without a due cost-benefit analysis and review, and also limiting which institutions, which government ministries, ministers can award those incentives, and also limiting and centralizing such that we know what this country or this government has given to a particular company. As it is, you have different ministries awarding different kinds of incentives to different companies. That is basically, we are losing resources that we could have harnessed to underpin our structural transformation. And just to get back to the point I was making around the informal sector, I was saying earlier that those at the lower end of the informal sector pay close to half of what they earn in tax. I mean, basically in different forms of taxes. And yet those at the top end pay no more than 8%. How do you raise resources? Because if you address those gaps, local assemblies, local authorities will be able to raise the resources, I mean, significant quantum of their resources from the local level, and they don't necessarily always have to look up to the central government. But that's why I think some are calling for a kind of a revision around the way we operate the local assembly system. It's important to give local assemblies some autonomy. As it is, they're overshadowed by the central government, depriving them of the opportunity to raise resources, particularly from big multinational companies that operate in their jurisdictions, and also investing in the economic activities that create jobs, that can create jobs and multiply effect on society. So again, the issue of agriculture, if we do not address agriculture in this country, it's impossible to move beyond it. It's impossible to raise our ability to basically provide for ourselves. And as I said, as we all know, globally, aid is dwindling. So whether you're moving away from aid or not, you don't have a choice. We have to move, but to move away, we need to seal those gaps. So just one last thing. We know that not just simply Ghana, but across the region, our countries are losing significant resources through tax avoidance, where companies use aggressive tax practices to basically draw rings around the tax regimes we have to be able to shift profits they make. I mean, a number of studies have been found in this country, major companies basically that are shifting resources to Mauritius, for example, others to Cayman Islands and the like, and Virgin Islands. Basically, that deprives our region of the resources to be able to address SDGs. Other than that, come 2030, we'll still be where we are. And I'm afraid the resources we are mining and extracting currently are finite anyway. So if we do not make the transition, we'll be poorer than we are 15 years from now.
So finally, what kind of policies would you want to see on a regional as well as on a national level fully implemented to make sure we narrow this inequality
So
gap?
back in 2009, for example, African leaders adopted what is known as the African Mining Vision, and ECOWAS moved on to develop the ECOWAS Mining Directive. One of the follow-up was supposed to be the development, harmonization of tax incentives in the region, because our countries are competing with each other. So it's no surprise Nigeria says it's not going to be part of the, the discussions around the Continental Free Trade Agreement, because it feels that it would lose out if it is signed in its current form. So the point to be made is that countries in the region are competing against each other. So Mali, Burkina, and Ghana competing against each other around, say, incentives to gold mining companies, as an example. Ghana, Senegal, Sierra Leone competing with each other to attract oil companies. And all of them are lowering the standards.
Race to the bottom.
Race to the bottom, essentially. The thing is that the resources will be exhausted. When they are exhausted, what is the fallback position? Remember, Nigeria is just emerging out of recession because oil prices just collapsed.
Yeah.
And once it collapsed, basically the economy literally collapsed as well. We're not far from that, because if you have close to 40% of your revenue servicing debt, as IFS pointed out to the government currently, it means that you have very little room to function. So you need to step up and mop up the resources and invest them in sustainable areas that can outlive the extractive sector. We've been so dependent on the extractive sector, I'm afraid it's cyclical. There could be another 2007, 2008 bubble in the next year, and there's no fallback position. So whilst we have the resources, it's important for us to seal the loopholes the companies and also the elite basically take advantage of to extract resources out of our countries and ensure that we not only retain the resources, but we invest them in sustainable areas that can outlive the extractive sector, like investing in agriculture, investing in hardcore infrastructure, roads, bridges, education, health, and the like, and technology.
Okay, thank you. And on that note, we'll end today's conversation with IFS. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll be back for another round next week.